Hey everybody, this is Ben Bowman and Alex Titus. Welcome back to another episode of The Oregon Bridge.
Given the polarity that we exist in right now, I can't imagine any news organization that would be seen as a straight down the middle, just given how sharp everyone's opinions are. Because like people as a whole are getting more polarized, I believe. And certainly we are hearing that from lawmakers. Redistricting is so tough because there are a trillion reasons you could draw a line. I don't know that I ever got a fully square explanation from anyone on why the maps are drawn. Coincidentally, their best, fairest map is pretty favorable to their side.
All right, everyone. Today we are very, very excited because we have our first guest who comes from the space of journalism. Today we've got Dirk VanderHart. If you listen to public radio, you know Dirk's voice, if not his name. He's one of the most prominent Oregon political journalists, and he's actually got a very interesting story about how he arrived in Oregon and joined OPB. He previously was at the Portland Mercury before that, and several other various news outlets across the Midwest, actually across the country, before he landed in Oregon. And it was a great conversation. Titus, what were your main takeaways? What did you appreciate the most?
Yeah, so back to that podcast thing. Before I actually met JD Vance in person, I listened to Hillbilly Elegy on Audible, and you heard his voice. And then you hear the guy talking in person. You're like, it's the voice, but with the face. That's exactly what I thought of Dirk, because I listened to the podcast. No, it was a really fun conversation because we cover everything from what I would say are like really big topics, like the downfall of local journalism, like the place of OPB and other local outlets within, reviving civic culture and things like that, all the way to sort of the nitty gritty politics, what the insiders are hearing about redistricting, the new maps, and all of that fun stuff. And Dirk clearly really knows what he's talking about too, and is well sourced and has interesting perspectives. So I think it'll be a good episode that everybody will enjoy, both for kind of the big ideas of what you're used to on the Oregon Bridge, but also the nitty gritty insider baseball of some of the hottest political issues that are pressing right now.
For sure. I don't know if he has ridden the most, but definitely among the most of any journalist on the issue of redistricting in Oregon. We joke on the podcast, like he's written dozens of articles that have kind of kept people abreast throughout the long extended, short term, but many big events in a short period of time for the Oregon redistricting process. And he also spent much of the week in the courthouse listening to the oral arguments of folks on both sides of the redistricting debate. So he's got a very, very valuable perspective and shares some things that I definitely was not aware of until we spoke to him. So love that part of the conversation. And also I think we want to be intentional about talking about journalism and the impact of the decline of local journalism. And Dirk's got an awesome perspective there that I think will be valuable for our listeners as well. So with that, Titus, anything to add?
Nope. I think we'll dive right in.
All right, let's go straight to the episode. Thanks, everyone. All right, and with that, we would like to welcome today's guest, OPB political reporter Dirk VanderHart. Dirk, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm great. It's late Friday afternoon, so there are worse times.
That is true. We made it through the week. Yeah. So we wanted to start a little bit. You are our first journalist guest on the podcast. So we're excited to talk to you a little bit about journalism, about politics, but we wanted to start with your identity as an Oregonian, if you consider yourself one. We were looking at your work history, and you've worked in a lot of different states, mostly for, it looks like, media journalism jobs. But what brought you to Oregon? Do you consider yourself here to stay? And then how did you end up at OPB, your ultimate job? So give us a little bit of your travels.
Yeah, so I am originally from Michigan. I grew up in Grand Rapids and spent the bulk of, actually, I guess about half of my life there. I went to Michigan State for journalism. Go Spartans. You're right. I worked in a number of places. I worked, had internships in DC, Ohio. Out of college, I got my first newspaper job at a newspaper in Springfield, Missouri, which is third largest city in the state, Southwest Missouri, just like a hop, skip, and a jump from Branson. If you're familiar with the circus-like atmosphere that is Branson, Missouri. If not, get familiar with it. And yeah, I was there 2 years. I was covering the courts and the justice system, and made, maybe not the most well-advised move. I decided at some point in 2009, I think, that I did not want to live in Missouri. It wasn't, where I was from. It wasn't, it just, I made the decision that it wasn't for me. So quit my newspaper job at a time when newspapers were shedding jobs rapidly, and certainly there wasn't a lot of opportunity. And I had a lot of friends out in Portland. I had a number of friends from growing up that had moved out here. I had visited and enjoyed it. So sort of a cliche, I guess, like drop your job, move to Portland, ride your bike a lot. I mean, as much as I hate to simplify it like that was sort of my story. Got here in 2009. And, it was, as I suggested, not a lot of newspaper jobs. The Oregonian was like at stasis or laying people off, whatever. You guys are probably familiar with some of the trends. And I ended up freelancing for the Oregonian for a while, kind of just working around town. I actually was a karaoke jockey for a while.
No kidding.
Okay.
Which was actually a really awesome job and kind of an amazing diversion. And then ended up in, 2013, getting a full-time job for the Portland Mercury, where I covered city matters, poverty, wound up taking the news editor spot there in 2015. And then in 2018, got a job at OPB covering state politics, which brings us to the present, essentially.
So I know Titus wants to ask a question about like media landscape, but before that, I'm curious. I think of OPB, Titus might disagree, but I think of OPB as like very unbiased, like very careful about how you present information, how you present side. Whereas I feel like the Mercury, even in their reporting, it feels more comfortable editorializing sometimes. Did you have to change your style when you've moved, or were you kind of the same Dirk that you were at Mercury when you got to OPB?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say that like in any alt weekly, right, which is what the Mercury is, what Willamette Week is, there is that editorial voice that you can have. You can essentially choose your own adventure at places like this. And certainly the Mercury, probably most people would think of it as having a more liberal tilt. I would say, and what I told OPB, in fact, as I was, interviewing for this job, was like, I think if you look at my work at the Mercury, even the column I ran, like I would say that I was fair in almost every instance, and certainly tried to play down the middle. That doesn't mean like I did have a column. I certainly swore more in my copy at the Mercury. But like, I don't think there's any like super like partisan hack job that you could point to that I did there. It was like down the road journalism, like trying to satisfy a public service and inform people and unearth things. So like, I would say the missions are similar, but you're absolutely correct that the vibe of those two places can be different if that's how you choose to pursue it. And to answer your other question, like I've been in Oregon, like I said, since 2009. My wife is from here. I met her out here. I don't see myself leaving. I'm not sure I consider myself an Oregonian though. That's tough because I still really like hold the Midwest heritage dear. So
I mean, you have the beanie, you got the beard, there's the Portland picture in the background. You're becoming a convert, Dirk. If you're,
yeah.
Maybe the full come to Jesus moment hasn't happened yet, but we're close.
It's fair. That's a fair point.
Awesome. Cool. I want to actually take kind of a step back. So, I mean, you've worked for a number of different publications, across the country. You worked in Missouri, as I also worked for the Houston Chronicle. Yeah. Kind of like describe for us both your journey, but also what does the journey of journalism look like as you've kind of moved on, right? So like, I imagine that the first job you had, just in terms of literally the technology, the software that you're using, maybe the types of stories that you write, maybe the stories you even pursue, has changed dramatically kind of over that time span. Could you kind of walk us through that journey of what does that look like? And maybe I'll joke that like maybe your first job you started, I don't know, maybe your stories were like pen and paper or something, or like just using computer. There's no Twitter. But yeah, kind of like what did that journey for you look like, and kind of like what are the most dramatic changes that you've seen from then to now?
Well, just to be frank with you, it's probably not quite as stark as you're envisioning, right? So like my first newspaper job was 2007. From the gate there, they gave me a laptop and that was my machine. And that's, and that is still very much the model of newsrooms today, even OPB. They give you a laptop, like that is your primary work machine and you're going off. I think Twitter started in 2007. So, even when I was I guess when I was in college, right, we all had desktops and we were sort of mired and married to that place. And that has certainly gone away. In terms of technology, though, I do not think it's going to be that satisfying of an answer. Like the iPhone obviously has done some dramatic things, as has the evolution of Twitter in terms of like going out for Portland protests and like the bulk of your coverage being live tweeting it and just embedding tweets into a story or having that inform your newsroom or that sort of live coverage. We do that a lot. Obviously in like radio journalism, which I made the switch to, I've got a lot of microphones and weird thingamajigs that I didn't use before. But like, I have never been I graduated from college in 2005. I have never been the journalist that takes notes longhand. I'm really bad at taking notes longhand. Like if you see me in the Capitol or something, I'm often going to want to come to someone's office with my laptop and take notes on that. So, I just don't think like, God, I'm probably missing something really big. I mean, clearly like digital and the way the digital landscape has shaped journalism has changed a great deal from daily newspaper deadlines to let's rush and get it up, and can we beat someone with a good report, and like the iterative sort of journalism that we do today, right, where it's like if there's a breaking story, we want to get it up online and then we're going to keep pushing it as we can. That was called a write through back in the day. It still is, but like we do that in a different form, but it's very much the same thing. I know I'm going to kick myself, Alex, when we get out of this. And I'm like, no, this huge thing has changed. And what am I talking about? I guess it just really does. Yeah. I don't know.
So I think to shift Alex's question a little bit, the one side that you've already alluded to changing significantly is the business side of the industry. Right. And I think like, so part of, you mentioned like jobs were sort of declining. There's a very famous Columbia Journalism Review article about Oregon State House reporters, where it's like, right. I think it peaked at like 40 or 50, and then it just declined for 20 years. And I feel like, and this is part of my next question for you, is it feels to me like, I'm sure you've seen Oregon Capital Chronicle is a new publication on the scene. I think they've got 3 reporters plus their editor-in-chief. So it feels like that dip is maybe coming back up. Maybe there's, it also feels like, I can't remember which Oregonian reporter, but one Oregonian reporter tweeted about how basically since they moved to a paywall, there haven't been any layoffs at the Oregonian. So it seems like we might be turning a corner. But I'm curious, like given the trends that you've lived through in terms of just massive shedding of staff, are you optimistic about the future of local journalism, pessimistic about the future of local journalism? How do you feel?
Oof. Just full disclosure, you sent me the fact that you might be asking about this before the podcast. And I thought about it and I'm like, do I want to say I'm pessimistic? I mean, so it's really, really hard to be optimistic right now when you look at, I mean, just what the trends have been with how the digital landscape has changed. The business model, advertising is way down, with this trend of these big vulture capital funds buying up newspapers left and right and sort of systematically gutting them, and that sort of being this unstoppable force. So like where I started was newspapers, and it's just so hard. And now COVID like has further decimated the landscape and made things hard. It's really hard to be optimistic about that facet right now. I would say like the beauty of where I am right now is Oregon Public Broadcasting has a really amazing base of support from its donors. People really support the service we do. We feel that in so many ways, not just financial, but in the back and forth with listeners, just the feedback. So that has been really, really gratifying working here in a place that feels like it's on some stable footing. And I think look, no one knows what the hope is, right? Like there are people that would theorize that there needs to be far more public dollars in journalism, that there needs to be a federal government subsidy that helps prop this up. And they would argue there's a constitutional like nexus for that and what the framers were trying to do. And then there's all these nonprofit models that are springing up, and can we find the kinds of donors that public radio has been able to make happen? And I think there's could be some really exciting shifts there. We are seeing it tentatively, but yeah, I mean, just in terms of like the thing that I sort of loved in journalism school, like with like newspapers being this sort of flagship, and there's great 2 newspaper towns where reporters are slugging it out for scoops, and like all this really great stuff that was in like the heyday. It's super, super hard to be optimistic about that. I also, whenever you talk to someone about this, they will say, but stories are always going to need to be there, and reporting is always going to need to be there, right? And that is such a cliche, and it is one that I have more and more just kind of found myself answering like, no, like not necessarily. I mean, this stuff could go black, and there are studies that suggest that is very, very bad for localities. I'm sure you guys have read or heard about this. Like
yes, corruption goes up, democratic participation goes down.
Right.
Interestingly, this is what I just saw. Someone tweeted about this. Like, if you poll just average people, they actually think local journalism is doing fine. they don't like perceive a problem. And I think that sense of like, oh, somebody's covering this stuff, somebody's writing about this, is like part of what complicates the problem you've outlined. Is like, if people don't sense a problem, there's no sort of stimulus to fix it.
Yeah. Part of me also thinks that the cynical part of me also thinks that like when there was a daily newspaper and everyone got it, like that was great. We didn't have web metrics. I don't know. I would be so curious how many of the stories that were just the bread and butter of daily papers actually got read or looked at. And now we have that super, super deep down, and we know where people are looking and not. And it's fascinating to me what some of the suppositions were in a more naive, like less digital time.
Well, and so Dirk, you hit on this a little bit more, but I want to dive a little bit more into it in terms of the different business models with subscribers, or I know some newspapers are even getting fancy and you can like literally click to pay 50 cents just to read this article or whatever, right? So that more people are moving behind a paywall. That doesn't seem to be going away. That's probably just going to keep increasing over time. So you have that sort of, I'd say, newer business model, or at least, the market is sort of maturing there. Then you also have the OPB model, which is the nonprofit side of things. And you have donors. I mean, I imagine you guys also make some money, but probably not enough to actually pay for the operational costs. I'm sort of curious, and I don't want to put you on the spot too much to bash one paper or the other, but like one thing that I think that the new, and I've talked about this a bunch, this shouldn't be surprising to any of our listeners, that the subscriber model does is you're so incentivized to talk to that specific group of subscribers that I think it can really make for not only more biased reporting, but also just like the types of stories people cover, right? So, I mean, for example, I imagine if you looked at the average New York Times subscriber, they're probably upper middle class, probably white, and probably more left or liberal to the spectrum, right? Like when their reporting is happening, I'm not saying this is happening in all cases, right? But like, they do have to cater to that specific audience because that's what their subscribers, right? Like those are literally the people who pay the bills. Whereas I feel like with, at least as you were literally just talking about with the metrics, is that like you could write a devastating story, maybe not devastating, but like what if there's some major sort of corruption scandal and like you write about this, but no one cares because, oh, Dirk's story only got 200 clicks. So like advertisers are like 200 clicks, like no one cares about that. Like that's making like pennies on the dollar. I'm sort of curious just kind of your general thoughts on that. Is like, it seems like, I'm not saying that subscriber-based publications don't have good scoops and don't expose corruption or scandals and things like that. But like, I feel like that the sort of incentive model has shifted because of that. I'd just be kind of curious of your response, because you've obviously worked for both for-profit and nonprofit at this point.
Yeah. So to the extent, I mean, I just like, so we have a donor base, right? So we I guess in the theory that you are positing, like we would be thinking a lot about OPB's donors and tailoring our coverage to that. And I can just like, there is literally not anything that I encounter on a daily basis that is, whatever, like Daddy Warbucks gave us $50,000 last year. And he like there, I could just like, I believe it's probably tempting for people to see it like that.
No, sorry. To clarify, I was saying actually nonprofit, I think, especially from small dollar, give more independence compared to like the paid for-profit subscriber bases.
Okay, well, so I just to continue the point, like, maybe the New York Times is like that. I don't know if they feel like they need to satisfy the Upper East Side WASPs, or they just feel like they're putting forward public service journalism. I mean, what I can say is this: like, there is a definite difference between commercial and what we do at OPB, and it's not what you think. Like, I will not be the person to moralize. Like, OPB has this higher minded public service, because I've come from these newsrooms, and I truly feel like the people that work in these newsrooms all have the same basic true north, which is, unearthing corruption, if that be the case, but also trying to ensure there's an informed electorate, because that is very much a basis of our country. And just keeping people generally informed and acting as a watchdog. Like the Oregonian does that, like any newsroom worth its salt is trying to do that if it's really about the job. But you're not wrong that the commercial, like the business pressures are very, very different. And the metrics, like Chartbeat, if you guys are familiar with it, is a very real deal, which is like this service you subscribe to that will show each of you, for instance, each of your articles and how they're doing, and who's looking at your, how many people are looking at your story in real time or your site in real time. Like, there are websites that have Chartbeat on big monitors, and that is very much like this is driving the news, right? One of the things that I really appreciate about OPB is that that is not where we are. We don't have to do that because of the stability of the model. So we are really able, I think, to more purely pursue things that we think are in the public interest or interesting or worthwhile. And that doesn't mean we're not trying to pursue things that are really going to get a lot of clicks or that people are interested, but it is not a overriding force. I'm still not sure I'm answering your question, Alex. So if I'm not, please feel free to guide me in the right direction.
Oh, no, I don't think there's a right answer to it one way or the other, right? I mean, it's right. That's totally just kind of my opinion on what's happening. But actually, even to kind of build off of that, one thing that I wanted to ask you about, and sort of the theme of our podcast, right, is that national politics is overtaking everything at this point. And Oregon is such a prime example of this, more so than I think Idaho or Wyoming or Vermont or whatever. Is people just tend to pay attention to Oregon more across the country than I think that they do with many other states, partially because of things that are happening in Portland, partially because of things that are happening in rural Oregon. And one thing that I'm curious, kind of from your perspective, is, and this is my opinion, right? So obviously I'm not saying this is right and you have to agree with me,
sure.
Is that when a publication like the New York Times, or you could even say Fox News too, we'll just at both sides of the aisle, when they're writing something about what's going on in Portland, for example, I feel like that the articles that are always coming out are much more biased towards one way or another. They're much more clicky, right? Destroying downtown Portland or whatever, compared to the sort of reporting that you guys do on these issues, which again, I don't want to call it toned down as in terms of that it's boring or it's squishy or something like that. I just feel like it's it's more hard news than it is editorialized. And kind of getting to a point that Ben said earlier is oh, well, Titus might not think that OPB is biased. I can think that one way or another, but I think that local journalism in general is just a lot less biased than when national publications start reporting on local issues. I'm kind of curious if your general thoughts just on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that is same as it ever was, just to be frank with you. It is well known that when national reporters dive in, not always and not all national reporters, but it's a feeding frenzy, such as we saw, for instance, last summer in Portland with the federal courthouse and all that stuff. I mean, it is nothing new that folks come in from out of town and don't have the nuance, maybe don't really try to get the nuance, or maybe to your point are having this more, I mean, they want to have a more simplistic frame. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to national producers from one station or another that, really want to assert this frame and wonder if I can speak to this and I'm not comfortable with it, right? Because it's very easy, I think, especially from a national talk show perspective, to here's the problem with Portland, or here's this pivot that we want to explore. And it's not always that simple. So I'm not even sure I fault them for it. I think part of it is just the way that dynamic works. You're coming in from out of town. You're not, you're thrust into something and you are trying to figure out what the story is and present it. Now, that's not to say that people don't use that and do that to their own ends and with their own slants. I mean, clearly that happens, and probably more all the time with the media landscape that it is. But I guess I don't think it's new. I agree with you that Oregon has had its share of really notable national stuff, and I'm not sure if that's like endemic to Oregon. Maybe it is, or if it's just like we've been on a run, right, with like Malheur and Portland and all this other stuff that's going on. It really does, like even like the walkouts, like there's just been a lot of interesting things that have happened. Maybe
I mean, for example, like if someone would have told me 2 months ago that the Newburgh School Board would be on like the front page of major publications, I'd be like, no one knows where Newburgh, Oregon is.
But that is a whole other thing too. That has a whole other thing to do with national media, right? Which is like it focuses people on these issues all around the country, and they take root and catch fire. Like the CR, I mean, like these school board things, right? Like critical race theory is this huge flashpoint, even though like critical race theory is very loosely defined in many people's minds, and like what you would actually call critical race theory, which is this like high level university thing, is not what people are talking about. I think most often there's it's just not that, but it has become a shorthand for a larger set of ideas that people are concerned with. And that wouldn't just be organically happening, right? Without like it being focused, it being the focus of national media, which is the other issue with like national stuff, is that it's more and more as newspapers go away, like we're talking about, as local news goes away, like that people become, I think, more centered on this national conversation, and so it makes its way out, right?
Well, and there's, I mean, the other side. This is a fascinating conversation. I'm really enjoying listening to it. There's also a question for me about like, is the tail wagging the dog, or whatever the expression is, because like, yes, national media is focusing on this, but like there's the New Yorker article about what's the name of the guy who basically he's like openly saying, I created the critical race theory controversy as a tactic for conservative organizing. So like part of it is the national media is responding to like when, a group of people go to shut down a school board meeting holding CRT signs, that's newsworthy. And we need to report on that. But like the media landscape, I do think there's sensationalism, that's real, like, but they're also responding to the fact that the local political landscape is actually kind of bonkers right now in terms of like we can look at the Portland school board meeting from last month, where like literally shut down because unmasked protesters come in, sit in a circle, give speeches about how literally their kids are going to die from the vaccine.
Well, that was like this week, wasn't it?
Just a few days ago. Yeah. So like, I do think there's a couple things happening. One, sensationalism in media is real, and national, I do agree. Like, to tie this to your point, I was thinking when you were talking, I do think it is true that like progressive or liberal readers self-select New York Times as their national publication, and conservatives probably go to Fox News or Wall Street Journal or whatever. I actually don't think this might be one place where I think Oregon, and maybe even state media more generally, is insulated. Like, I don't actually think, the Oregon Catalyst is obviously a conservative publication, but like when you look at Statesman Journal, Register Guard, Oregonian, Willamette Week, OPB, I don't think there's a clear, like, progressives would say the Oregonian veers conservative. Conservatives would say that Willamette Week veers liberal, but I don't think there's I don't read Willamette Week, because like conservatives love to read Willamette Week, and the good, the bad, and the awful, and all that stuff. So I kind of feel like the national stuff hasn't penetrated the Oregon media landscape, but I don't know if you agree with that.
I mean, I don't know if that question is to me. I think like historically, right, back in the day, the Oregonian was like this pretty conservative editorial board, and that's what it was known for. I don't know that you could call it that now. I mean, I think that in the sort of, I don't know if it's a function of a more degraded media landscape or not. I would agree. Like, I think by and large, you're not seeing like especially like papers on the level of Eugene or Salem, like have the editorial heft where people are like, oh, this is this beacon of liberal or conservative principles, right? I mean, but we do have, like, as you mentioned, like there used to be Blue Oregon. I guess that's gone, but that was like a progressive or democratic blog. And there's the Catalyst, and then Mike Neerman has the Northwest Observer, I think. Right. So like there are a variety of, areas expressing some of these opinions.
Yeah, and I would even say to that, Ben, I don't know, if like, let's even say I thought OPB was far to the left. Let's just say I thought that. I still think that no matter what, they would still write a more fair story than a national publication would, if I was trying to have like no bent or whatever. And that's why I think these conversations about local news and I've worked with local reporters from 13 different states now, because when I was traveling around the country with the vice president, we went all over the place: Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Iowa. I mean, we went all over the place. And like, I always actually felt that when I was working with local journalists, that like, for the most part, they were always just trying to basically report on what the story was. And maybe there was some sort of spin. Sometimes there was even conservative spin. I met a lot of like local journalists working at publications who, like, you could clearly tell they were big fans of Donald Trump. But I feel like no matter who, it was always just more about the news. It's like literally more about the news and less about the noise. And I just feel that part of the issue, I mean, as we've talked about so many times on the podcast, is that like, as local media just continues to die, I think that the business model will become more sustainable for like, oh yeah, we're the New York Times or we're the Fox News, whatever. Let's have an Oregon reporter who just reports on Oregon stuff, basically. And maybe you could argue you'll still get good perspectives, right? Because maybe if I want to get a right-wing perspective about Oregon, I go to the Fox News. If I want to get a left-wing perspective about it, I go to the New York Times or whatever. But I feel like that will always be more noise and less about actual news. And like, I'm not saying there's not a place for partisanship, right? I mean, I've written quite a few very conservative op-eds in my day, but like, I feel like there should be an outlet where people can go and they're like, okay, maybe this is slightly biased to the right or slightly biased to the left, but like, it is mostly just the news at that point. Like, what happened? Why does it matter? Like, what are the impacts? And I just feel like we're continuing to lose that, even with some of these publications that have been popping up.
That's a good plug to be a sustaining member of the Oregon Public Broadcasting.
Join Oregon Public Broadcasting. I mean,
that was a paid advertisement. No,
the only thing I would say is that, like, I feel like given the polarity that we exist in right now, I think it's impossible. Like, I can't imagine any news organization that would be seen as a straight down the middle, just given how sharp everyone's opinions are. Because like, there's a broad segment of people probably in Portland that think the New York Times is like trash and far too, has far too much deference to a lot of conservative positions, right? And like, probably a lot of people don't, but it's just, it's so much a matter of perspective. And I just don't know, like, that anyone could ever be the referee of what is the perfect down the middle. Like, I don't know.
It's so funny because the New York Times always gets in trouble for, like, Brett Stevens will publish some sort of op-ed or Ross Douthat will. Yeah. I literally see on Twitter, it's like, cancel the New York Times.
I'm unsubscribing.
This conservative voice, like, can't stand.
But those are opinion pieces. So like, that's what you expect. But like, even like, people used to be like, oh, Maggie Haberman, she's just an access journalist. She's a sycophant for Trump because she just wants this access. And so like, it's just, what, I don't know, but yet many people on the conservative side think that is the mouthpiece of the Democratic Party. And I don't think either of those are true. I
was thinking just now, Titus might laugh at this, but in last week's issue of the Liftoff, where we do, like, Titus and I are both like trying to contribute to a newsletter on Oregon politics that's like relevant to both sides. Titus used the word gun control and I changed it to gun safety. And it's like, depending, like, to me, gun control is loaded and is like inflammatory. And to him, gun safety is totally biased. And it's like, what the New York Times, OPB, everybody has to make a choice about what you're going to label the thing. We all know what we're talking about, but language is just so loaded that you're like, you can't, like, even talking about something in an unbiased way becomes biased based on the words you choose, which is reflective of where we are.
Exhausting. And I will just say, I use gun control because gun safety feels like it is the new thing that, like, is being slapped down to tamp down and like make things more anodyne, and gun control feels like what I grew up like thinking of that debate as. So I don't know if that's the right call or not. That's just
conservative reporter Dirk VanderHart.
Left-wing Twitter is about to riot right now.
Okay, so we are actually past time for the first half of the show. So we're gonna transition to. We also we want to talk meta journalism, but we also know that you're reporting literally every day on the most pressing political issues happening in Oregon. Obviously, in one of our most recent episodes, we had Reagan Knope on, who had a very specific viewpoint on redistricting and the partisan motivations and potential impacts. You reported literally, I want to say dozens of pieces on redistricting throughout this winding road of, the census was late, and so everything got combined, and depending on the hour of the day, it was oh my God, the legislature can't do it, the Republicans are walking out, holy cow, they're showing up, the committees it was just a wild ride.
And it's not done, by the way.
Right. So it could what is it, February is the deadline, so we still could have 4 months of.
I mean, I've sat through 15 hours of court hearings already this week on this stuff, and it's just anyway.
Wow.
So I guess my let's for a second put aside the fact that we don't actually know what the maps will look like. Let's assume that the legislatively approved maps or something very close to them move forward. What do you see as the implications for the future of Oregon and Oregon politics, not just based on the maps, but based on the process that yielded the maps? Obviously, there, as we heard from Reagan, there's some pretty severely damaged relationships based on what happened, but then there's also the maps, and we've got these congressional districts with a new seat and all that. So I'm curious, broadly from a high level, what do you see as the implications of this redistricting experience that we just lived through?
I mean, just so legislative maps, right? As you heard from Reagan, if people didn't listen, I think what he communicated is virtually what I've heard from Republicans, which is they feel like that was a decently squared deal. I mean, there are a few districts they really, really take strenuous issue with, but by and large, I think they felt like there was at least some fairness there. And yet, that map probably, I mean, and demographics shift all the time, and certainly they shift over a decade, right? But probably cements them in the minority for the next 10 years, right? And who knows how things change, but that's how it feels to me. Maybe someone that's looked deeper into the numbers is saying, Dirk's an idiot, but maybe that's, we are a blue state. Many people would say we're more purple than we get credit for, but maybe that is just the reality of where we are, that it is a Democratic or a Republican minority. So I think that is the likely future. Now, whether or not that means super minority, right, and Democrats having 3/5 in one or both chambers, I don't know that I see anything in the numbers that suggest that that's necessarily the case. And certainly Republicans think they can have a good showing next year, right, even in the legislature.
And real quickly, the reason super minority matters is
it used to matter
in revenue.
No, it's not walkout proof. It used to matter because of revenue. Tax bills need to pass by a 3/5 supermajority. It's a 2/3 supermajority is for quorum. Okay. So that, and I don't know that anyone's really talking about the D's getting that under these maps, at least not in the near term. And so without shifting to congressional maps, just the dynamics is really important, right? The dynamics are really important because probably many listeners know that there was a deal going into redistricting where the House Speaker, Tina Kotek, granted parity to Republicans on the committee. The assumption, I think, for a lot of people was that meant that meant the D's were going to have to come to the table with something potentially, or at least they would have to work in good faith. And that process got blown up for many reasons we could talk about, and Kotek pulled back on the deal. So I don't know what kind of ire that is going to have going forward. My sense is it is not going to be good, to the extent that Tina Kotek is still wielding the gavel in the House, right? And that won't be happening for much longer because she's running for governor. So we know that we have a short session next February. She will, we are told, be behind the dais. That could be a really, really difficult discussion. We know that some of her top lieutenants agreed with her decision and could be the type of people that are next in line for speaker. So how long does the acrimony stand? Our relationships, which are so strained between Christine Drazan, the minority leader, and Tina Kotek, repairable under some new leadership. It's very tenuous going forward, I think. And I'm rambling. So I don't know. Help me.
So my I'm sure Titus has some things too, but real quickly, what I have wondered about is, so we've talked a lot about like national polarization and like these national forces that are pulling our society apart. And then there's things like redistricting, where sure, national politics was part of it, but really those were people who could or couldn't communicate with each other. And I don't know if you could say that you can't directly at least point to national political polarization as the reason why those relationships frayed. So, but that being said, I think that the environment that the legislature more broadly is operating under, where you've got like your constituencies are more divided.
That's right.
Feeds it. So I don't know. Do you to what extent do you think that the national trends in terms of political polarization matter moving forward? Like, do you think that is a very real thing, and that's driving walkouts, for example, and all these other things?
Absolutely. And I think that lawmakers that have participated in this would tell you that, right?
Yes.
So like they, Herman Bertschiger, the former Senate minority leader, led a couple walkouts, and what he was saying, right or wrong, I don't know if this is him trying to pass blame, but like, he would say our constituencies demand it. Like we have constituencies that are more polarized than ever on both sides, right? Like more left and more right, and they are demanding certain things. And so if you want to have, it's some of the same type of stuff that's happening in Congress, right? Like people as a whole are getting more polarized, I believe. And certainly we are hearing that from lawmakers, at least those in like districts that lean heavily one way or another where that matters. Like, so they are feeling more torn. And I don't think it's a coincidence that since 2019, we've had like 4 or 5 walkouts, right? And now we're reading bills by computer in the House and Senate.
Right.
Part of that is certainly a leadership style. And Christine Drazan is a far different leader of House Republicans than Carl Wilson was before her. And she has made plain that she refuses to be walked on by the Dems, but she also has very, very few things she can do to not be walked on. And so it's just a very messy dynamic. Now, that could be a leadership style, but it probably also has partial root in what people are hearing from their constituencies and constituencies getting further apart. That's my read on it.
It's the Lynn Findley situation, the Senator Findley situation, where like him showing up to vote no on a gun bill was insufficiently conservative to a group of constituents. Now that didn't actually make it, and my read on it.
And Fred Gerard, by the way, almost got, like there was a recall on him.
Who was like, right, both of these gentlemen are very, very conservative senators politically, but like the base is basically saying it's not enough to vote no, you need to shut everything down.
And that was, just to be fair, I think a subsection of the base. That was the really hard and heavy gun rights groups that were doing that. So
neither made the ballot, right? Like both evaporated,
nor got anywhere close, as far as I can tell. So I don't know if that was a Republican groundswell again. I don't think that at all.
Agreed. Titus.
Yeah, and Dirk, I also want to talk a little bit about the congressional map, not just the ledge map. So. When was this? This honestly may have been 2 years ago. I was talking to Ben on the phone once. We were talking about redistricting because, of course, we're political nerds. I know this was a couple of years ago because I was still living in D.C. And I told Ben, I said, if I was the Dems, what I would do to get the maps through, because we had both thought basically we're going to get another seat. I would make a swing district that encompassed all of Bend, and that district will probably be like +1, maybe +2, +3 R. But as time moves on, it will probably go into the D category, not safety, but like, lean D at least. This was also before coronavirus, where I know that the number of people who moved to Bend, particularly from very liberal areas, also dramatically for Bend, increased the population.
Yeah.
I'm sort of curious because you're talking to these lawmakers, you're obviously really plugged into this issue. Do you think that was kind of the reasoning behind this? Because like I look at, for example, let's take a look at Illinois. Illinois, I think, was slated to have like 16 Democratic seats and 4 Republican seats. And they basically just went to their legislature. They're like, it's not liberal enough. So now there's going to be 17 Democratic seats and like 3 Republican seats or something.
Is that true? Is that real? That's real.
Yeah, it like, I mean, I think even the New York Times called it like blatant gerrymandering. They got like an F score from the Princeton, redistricting institute or whatever. Like, it is just very blatant gerrymandering what's happened in Illinois.
And Oregon did too as well, by the way. But
oh yeah, well, I definitely think it was gerrymandered. I think it could have been a lot worse than it actually is now. And I mean, we'll see what the courts do. But like, was that sort of the decision making, or I'm curious of like what you were hearing from people on the congressional map in particular.
Well, is your question whether or not they built Bend in as this little secret that's going to give us?
Yes. Was there literally like the dark and true Alex Titus strategy? Because this is very bad. If I get maybe Ben pass this on to Speaker Kotek from me directly.
Yes,
so that would indict me in this endeavor very badly. But kind of like, what were you hearing about like how the maps were made? Like,
yeah,
and there's like DeFazio, I know, was pissed. Schrader was pissed from the fastest. Like, we have a super interesting redistricting here on the congressional side. So yeah, really interested in like what you were hearing, how things were playing out.
It's really, this is like probably the single most partisan and political thing I've ever covered. And it's amazing. And so like, I don't know that I ever got a fully square explanation from anyone on why the maps are drawn. Both sides, like, it's amazing to me. Both sides are moralizing so heavily about fair maps and whatnot. And just coincidentally, their best, fairest map is pretty favorable to their side. It's just an amazing coincidence, right? Like, I think
who could have foreseen this?
The Bend thing is fascinating, right? Because it is like probably the single most controversial piece of that congressional map. That Bend, now I guess it's the fifth, like spanning the Cascade Mountains going to Portland, and like for the first time ever, Bend is connected to the Portland region. I don't think it's I don't think it's this time bomb. Like, everyone is expecting Bend to go bluer. It's blue right now. So like, people see that probably as a very, very naked play for a bluer district. Right now, the fifth, as drawn, as far as we can tell, is a pretty swingy district, especially if Schrader elects not to run for re-election and there's not the power of incumbency. Like, that could be a super interesting race in a year that is expected to favor Republicans. But yeah, I mean, I am fascinated by the notion. And so I don't know, like, I have not, just to my failing, I would say, like, I've certainly heard a lot of theories, and I've talked to a lot of people who believe they know the thinking, and it gets really convoluted and like very conspiratorial. Right. Nothing I've heard is the type of thing I'm willing to put forward as fact on this podcast. And like, the people you talk to that did it will just say, no, we are trying, there's just, redistricting is so tough because there are a trillion reasons you could draw a line. Yes. And that's why even the most blatant gerrymander often and I'm not saying that, like, I definitely think that these maps have some biases for sure. And I think a lot of the metrics you look at would suggest that, though it's not only for the Dems in every case. But anyway, the most gerrymandered map, you could still moralize and say, no, we are taking care of, like, there's just a trillion ways to describe these things. And that's what's going to make it so tough with this court case to try to prove intent, to try to prove that Tina Kotek got on the phone with Peter DeFazio and said, I'm giving you this district and we're going to do this. And guess what? We're blowing up the deal for you, Congressman. Like, right? Like,
yeah, well, it's funny because you talk about the conspiracies, and I've literally, at least on the Republican side, the only Democrat I've really talked about this has been, I've heard everything from like, yeah, like, it's just smart. Like this is like smart marketing to be like, no, like, look, we have these swingy districts. And then I've heard the totally other side that was like, no, like, Speaker Pelosi literally called Kotek and was like, this is what's going to happen. I was like, I don't think that one happened.
I mean, the Republicans have said, like, heavily suggested that there was a hard lean on the Democrats to hold the line on the map. But it is true that they did give some ground at the end. Like I didn't expect it to happen. I mean, that map is a different map than the one they put forward at first. It is less biased. It still could well lead to a 5-1 split, though. As I mentioned, I've been sitting through 15 hours of court hearings on it this week, and like, there's 4 different political scientists who've taken the stand and offered various like stances on what is likely to happen or what might not happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing too, and then I'll let you transition, is like, what I think people are overlooking is, if I'm Speaker Kotek, I'm running for governor. I don't like, okay, maybe there's pressure from National Democrats or Eric Holder's group, whatever. I'm sure those phone calls probably did happen. Who knows what was said, but like, I'm running for governor in a blue state and I need to win a primary. So like, here's a pretty good notch on my belt to like deliver us some wins and make everybody happy with me. Like no one's just kind of given that basic observation, which I like, to me, that probably seems like the most compelling case of what happened, but I mean, who knows, but I just wanted to add that too.
There is a fervor, I would say, that I've seen among Dems, right? And you guys talked about this in a former episode, but like the Republicans lead a lot of legislatures and are tweaking a lot of maps to their advantage, and so Dems really think it's time for them to play that same brand of hardball, which I think many of them think they were too cowardly or like play nicey to do. And so when people see Kotek just like breaking the deal, potentially shattering good vibes in the state house to do it, like people see that as like yes, like Dems are actually playing hardball. I mean, that certainly was an undercurrent I was seeing on Twitter.
I would agree. I think the unspoken thing from Democratic voters or supporters is like, nobody loves gerrymandering. People who care about small d democracy don't love gerrymandering. And I actually, looking at Oregon's maps versus like, for example, Illinois' maps, I don't think you can say they're in the same zip code of gerrymandering. But unilateral disarmament, where all the Democrats moved to independent redistricting and we try to do things without partisan influence, while Texas and North Carolina and Florida and whatever are drawing their maps, leads to a deeply unfair and inequitable outcome across the country. And so like, I'm not sure that was part of the legislative consideration, but I know that's how like voters feel.
But, and to Alex's point, that's a selling point too. Like maybe, I mean, multiple things can be true, right? Like there could be that actual sentiment, and it's also like, I'm this Democratic champion who I don't know. And I'm not suggesting that is definitively her strategy. I am speculating quite a bit, but just chatting about it.
Yeah, that's you mentioned like you didn't feel comfortable bringing forward theories on this podcast, and we have a very low standard of what meets our threshold for this podcast, so they're out there. Yeah. So our last category, our last kind of broad question here is, we're heading into the 2022 elections, and it's already wild.
Oh man.
We by one person's count I was just talking to, they're saying up to 15 people turning over just in the House Democratic caucus, which is less than 40, because of people running for other offices or not returning or whatever. That trend is, I think, true across caucuses, across chambers. Looking at definitely a new speaker. You're looking at likely a new Senate president, although we don't know. He could have many more years of Senate presidency in him, Senate President Courtney. But if that happens, you're also probably looking at like maybe shifts in leadership at other levels, down
new budget chairs, but probably.
Yep, exactly. And then you've also, of course, got a new governor, but it's not just a regular governor's election. You've got the sort of like, not traditional, but the candidates who we all expected in the Speaker of the House, the state treasurer, potentially the Attorney General on the Democratic side. Now we've got celebrity New York Times columnist who had a Instagram video from Jennifer Garner, who tagged him on Twitter, on Instagram.
I missed this. Now I got to look it up.
Yeah, Jennifer Garner did an Instagram story, and Nick Kristof like retweeted it or whatever on Instagram, posted it on his. And then you've got Betsy Johnson, who is a fascinating figure in Oregon politics. I would probably say objectively the most interesting figure in Oregon politics. Fascinating, hilarious, powerful. So like, it was funny. I labeled her as a moderate Democrat and got yelled at because they're like, no, she's a conservative Democrat. She votes against gun stuff. She votes against environmental stuff, et cetera, et cetera. She's running as an independent. Then on the Republican side, strangely, in a state where Republicans can never win, everybody wants to run this time. There's like 15 people who have filed for this office.
Yeah, I would. Everyone though, out of a strain, like
sure.
Okay. Yes, but
so all that as like broad context of like, we're heading into what I will editorialize and say perhaps the most transformational Oregon election in at least decades. Do you agree with that analysis? Like, do you see the massive shifts that are going to basically determine what the decision-making landscape looks like? And B, what are you in particular watching as like important or big sort of pivot points that could impact what the state looks like?
Yeah, no, your preamble is just stealing my fire because you're like laying everything out. But no, I don't know that I've analyzed legislative trends that deeply. Like I didn't know that it was 15 Ds turning over. Like who knows what that does to that caucus. If it's true, it's a caucus that's gone ever more leftward and has lost some of its more moderate members recently. And so if that trend continues, like that'll be super interesting. It will likely inform who the next speaker is. But no, I mean, leadership in the House and Senate, super, super interesting. Both the people that are at the top of those chambers are the longest to ever do it. You know, Kotek has really solidified power in her chamber. And so like, that's just going to be huge dynamic shifts. And then, like I said, budget chairs like are likely to turn over. I mean, really just right now, all eyes have to be on the governor's race. Like it is insanely interesting. And not like, for so many reasons, right? And we'll know even more on Tuesday when we know who wins in Virginia and like what is the actual undercurrent that's happening. If that happens, right, I think it's pretty likely we see what I would term as a potentially more compelling Republican candidate come into the race, because I really think the R's think that Betsy gives them a shot. Like I think the R's believe that Betsy breaks in their favor, that this could be like an opportunity to shoot the curl, if you will. I don't know what that, but you know what I mean? Like to take this opportunity, like she can potentially, I know they believe that she can take enough votes from the Dems to make the math work if they get the right candidate. And
wait, like, is that really what you've been hearing from some R's? I've heard the exact opposite. Like I did this little section for the liftoff of like how R's are looking at the governor's race. And this one senior Republican campaign official said, her jumping in as an independent, they thought was the nightmare scenario. Then literally like 2 days later, she jumped in.
So that is what the Democrats have told me. They believe it breaks. They believe it's.
So she's just everyone's nightmare, basically.
No. The Democrats Democrats believe. I think the Democrats are concerned. They don't. I don't know that anyone knows exactly what it is, but I think there are people that definitely think it hurts the Republicans quite a bit. But I have talked to, I talked to folks in Republican campaigns that think that it presents a real opportunity.
I would agree. I would agree with that. I think my gut says it helps Democrats more, but I just talked to a Democrat who I would say is very intelligent on these issues, who says that if you look at partisan voting behavior, Republicans, especially in the post-Trump era, are much less likely to split ticket vote. So you combine that with the fact that Betsy Johnson is like timber unity, and like, if I'm a Republican, my chances of beating a Democrat head to head just aren't very good in Oregon. So if you throw something that's a curveball that at least presents a potential, like I think that at least probably gives them an avenue that they didn't have before.
And I don't pretend to know, like, you know, I mean, it's so interesting. Most people, I would say, I mean, most people I've talked to, and again, like they are partisans and they're party people, don't think Senator Johnson is going to stand a chance. They think that it's too hard to siphon away people who are used to checking the R or D box. But I think there's no question that she will have the money to run a notable campaign, and that she can be a compelling figure in terms of speaking. So I'm so fascinated by it. I mean, it's going to be wild. And you know, I do want to see how the Republican field shapes up, if at all. I mean, you know, I don't know that they've brought their best yet, but not anyone. I keep hearing
rumors. I don't know if you're hearing these too. I keep hearing, you know, Drazen, Tootie Smith. I keep hearing there's other sort of bigger figures who are flirting with the idea, but I just feel, I don't know, like, I know we're starting earlier than historically is true, but like these people have already raised $500,000 in some cases. Like you've got Bud Pierce who can self-fund. Like I don't know.
Bud and Bridget are raising a lot of money.
They're raising a ton of money, and I don't know. Like I don't think.
So is Stan too. Yeah.
It's like this is like a long discussed trend in Oregon politics, at least. Like, and I think the first example is like Jason Bowe used to be Senate president, was a towering figure in like Salem insider circles, ran for statewide office, and then lost in a primary to a Lane County commissioner named Bob Straub. And so the problem for people like Christine Drazen, I feel like, is I don't feel like most voters know who she, or I mean, maybe even Tootie Smith has like a larger profile from her county perch, but I feel like we as political insiders see Drazen as like someone who's super smart, strategic, like effective at what she does, but does that translate to a voter base? I don't actually know.
I don't think people know who, I mean, like less people know who Tina Kotek is than you would think too, right? Just because, I mean, at least like, I think when you see polls on name recognition, it's far, far lower than might be expected. Arguably Rosenblum would have the best starting point. I think a lot of people say that, but it's not, she's, you know, there's a lot of people in this race at this point, and it doesn't seem like she's hastening to get in. So I don't know.
It will be fascinating to track. We are a little over time, so we apologize for going over.
That's okay.
But our last question that we like to close out with is first to say thank you, but then also if people want to read some of your reporting, a lot of the things we discussed, you've already written long form pieces about. So if they want to get in touch with you or follow your work, what's the best way to do it? And what's the best way to read the stuff that you write?
Oh, and also, by the way, OPB has its own politics podcast, OPB Politics Now, that people can check out. If people are listening to this and want like more politics nerdery, like I think you guys do an awesome job and dive deep, but we are there for you every week. But yeah, I mean, I'm Dirk. I'm at opb.org. We have a 3-person politics team at this point, and yeah, we do a lot of this stuff, so people should check it out. And if anyone wants to email me, DVanderHart at opb.org.
Do you know your Twitter handle offhand?
Yeah, it's Dirquez, DIRQUEZ.
There you go.
It's an old one.
Now you can get all the angry comments from things you said in this episode. So.
Are you guys getting a lot of angry comments on these?
No.
Not a ton. We get occasionally. There's some people who, like in the early days, there's still people who are like, and they've said this to me, and I think Titus gets it too. Like, you let your guest off the hook when they said something crazy. And it's like, well, if we spent the whole episode disagreeing on literally everything, it's not very interesting.
I'm personally grateful you guys to let me off the hook for almost.
You are easy to let off the hook because as a journalist, you're not sticking yourself out there too far. Although I'm sure someone will find something that they will disagree with you on.
Always.
But with that, thank you everybody for listening. Thanks, Dirk, for joining. And don't forget to subscribe to our pod and go subscribe to OPB Politics Now too. There's plenty of room for fish in the sea in the Oregon political podcast world. But thanks everyone. We'll see you next week.